It's early morning on a Friday morning. You get up early and you go to your student dining hall. When you go to your student dining hall, you're like, you know what? Even though I listened to the science behind that podcast, I'm in a waffle mood today. So you go fill your little cup up with batter and you put it in the waffle press and you make yourself a waffle. Then when you're going to go and put butter and syrup on it, you see that next to the butter there's this big vat of a butter-like looking substance, but it says margarine. So you Google margarine and you find a study here and there about how margarine is better for heart health and it decreases the risk of heart disease. But what exactly is heart disease? I mean, you hear it used all the time in the media, the obesity epidemic and increased risk for heart disease, and even how heart disease is one of the primary risk factors for COVID. But what exactly is heart disease? And how does something like margarine decrease your risk for heart disease? Well, you know what? Let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists out there, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I am your host, Atticus Hamilton, and in case you haven't gathered already, this is part of a 4-episode series on human health. Now, between now and next Friday, each one of these episodes are going to be about a different topic that is vital to understanding our own health, but not only that, but is also applicable in daily life, something that we all deal with on a daily basis. But ladies and gentlemen, before we can jump into today's episode about heart disease, I'm going to take a minute here and let all of you guys go and grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup in it, and then we can get started with today's episode of The Science Behind That. And welcome back, everybody. I hope you guys have yourself a nice cup of coffee right next to you. We're going to jump right in. So, heart disease is a very interesting topic to me personally, because it's one of those things in medicine that has a lot of misconceptions around it. And one of those misconceptions is that heart disease is one disease. I feel like a lot of people believe that heart disease is one disease. Somebody has heart disease. But in reality, heart disease is just a group. It's a name for a group of diseases that affect the heart. Some of those diseases are transmissible, caused by a pathogen, and others are not transmissible and not caused by a pathogen. So I think it would help to think of heart disease as a truck, right? A truck is just saying that's a truck does not tell you what brand it is. It just tells you that that's a truck. Because within the group of truck, you have Ford, you have Chevy, Honda, Ram, whatever. And it's the same sort of thing here. Heart disease is just a category. And within that category, you can break it up into 3 large subcategories: heart tissue diseases, coronary artery and non-coronary artery diseases, and infectious heart diseases. So I think it's best that we start with the first one, heart tissue diseases. So heart tissue diseases, a lot of them result from generally either CAD, coronary artery disease, or non-coronary artery disease. Sometimes it can also result from endocarditis, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But some of these diseases are things like myocardial hypoxia. So this is when the heart muscle itself loses oxygen and becomes devoid of any oxygen. And as a result, the heart muscle begins to die. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, because this is really important for things like heart attacks and coronary artery disease. Another one that I could think of off the top of my head, which is probably the most common type of disease in this subcategory, are congenital heart defects. So congenital heart defects are things like a deformed mitral valve or a deformed tricuspid valve, things of that nature. And congenital heart defects like this can cause a whole variety of issues. Some of these issues are like a murmur or blood turbidity, and other ones of these issues may progress all the way to heart failure. So in certain instances of congenital heart defects, maybe the valve itself doesn't fit very well with the walls of the heart. And so what happens is, let's say blood flows from the right atrium into the right ventricle. If the valve there between those two ventricles, the right atrioventricular valve, if the right atrioventricular valve is deformed, then blood may accidentally go back up into the atrium even though it's been pumped to the ventricle. And that's called blood regurgitation. And this can be an issue because after a while of living with this sort of situation, what can happen is the heart has to work harder to pump the same amount of blood around the body because some of it is being regurgitated back up into that atrium. And that can result in physical ailments like lightheadedness, oxygen depletion, things of that nature. Sorry, I had to take a sip of coffee there. Things of that nature. And as a result of that, you run the risk of patients who have congenital heart defects always run the risk that they may be severe enough to cause a heart attack or heart failure. This kind of leads us nicely into the next group or subgroup, which are coronary artery disease and non-coronary artery disease. So before we can really understand what's happening here, it's important for me to note this. A lot of people think that when the heart pumps blood throughout the rest of the body, that it's using some of that blood that it's pumping, which is not entirely true because the heart is not using the blood that's in the right ventricle or the left atrium. It's using the blood that's being delivered to the myocardiocytes from the coronary arteries. So the coronary arteries are these little arteries that come off the main arteries, like the iliac, the iliac artery and the aorta. They come off the sides of these big arteries, these big structures, and they feed the heart with blood. I believe there's like 20 to 26 of them. And they're really small because they don't need to be big because they're just supplying enough blood to feed the heart. So what happens in coronary artery disease is people can sometimes get plaques in those arteries, in the coronary arteries. And when that happens, that results in an inability of blood to flow to the heart properly, and as a result, people develop myocardial hypoxia. And if that's not treated, that can either lead to a heart attack or heart failure, but generally it goes from hypoxia to a heart attack to heart failure. And the heart is not able to recover very well from a hypoxic attack. And so what causes these plaques, you may be wondering? Well, these plaques are, I know some of you aren't going to like this, caused by fructose intake. For those of you who've listened to my podcast for a long time, you'll know that I have had sort of like this underlying theme where it's against fructose, and this is why. If you're not drinking fructose or eating fructose right after a vigorous workout, all of that fructose is going to be converted to something called VLDL, or very low density lipoprotein. This is going to move from the liver, where it's created, to the muscles, where it's converted to LDL, or low-density lipoprotein. And what low-density lipoprotein does is it's less dense than blood, so because of it, it collects along the inside walls of the arteries, or the vasoendothelium, the arterial endothelium. It collects along the wall of those vessels, and macrophages come along. They eat it because they think it's a pathogen, and they turn into a type of cell called a foam cell. Now, these foam cells are immobile. They're not able to move anywhere. And so they just sit there and they build up over time, because the more foam cells you have, the more immune cells come there to react to it because they think it's a pathogen. And then the more foam cells you have. So it's just this never-ending loop. It's this self-magnifying trend. And so in an attempt to keep it away from the body, because the body thinks it's a pathogen, the body walls it off with a calcium-like solution, kind of similar to the formation of a granuloma inside the lungs of tuberculosis patients. And so this results in the narrowing of these blood vessels. And eventually, the blood going through these vessels gets down to just a trickle. And then you have to worry about embolisms, because if they get so narrow that the vessels start to bow outwards, they could rupture and cause an embolism. And a lot of times we see those in the lungs. We call those pulmonary embolisms. And so if this happens in the heart, it's a very dangerous situation, because it will almost immediately cause hypoxia in the heart. But this can happen anywhere throughout the body, in any artery, in any vein throughout the body. These blood vessels can narrow and patients can die. And this is heart disease. This is atherosclerosis. The most, I guess, I don't want to say most common, but the most thought of type of heart disease. When people say heart disease, they think of plaques, and this is what it is, atherosclerosis. And that causes coronary artery disease. And the final category is infectious heart disease. So that's things like endocarditis. So you have bacterial and you have fungal and viral endocarditis. And that is when a pathogen infects the myocardial sites, or the heart cells. It infects those and it replicates inside them. And much like with everything else, this kills the heart cells, and eventually the heart will go into heart failure. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode. Definitely tune in on Friday, because on Friday we're going to talk about probiotics and what they are and what they do and how they work and if you need them. So stay tuned for that episode. That'll be a fun one. And I hope you guys have a great Monday. Have a great week. And remember, as always, stand up and question everything.